De vuelta, la ventaja de la virtualidad.
We're back. One of the great things about virtuality is that you can bring your sandwiches and put them next to the computer. When we used to do this in in-person format, we had to go out to eat. So now that we didn't have very much time, you can carry on eating by the computer while I present the next panel, which I will be moderating, where we have an issue which was touched on briefly by Lucas Belli. He talked about the aspect of how internet and some social networks are being used. It was the issue of net neutrality, how this impacts on society and how this is perceived. It was quite interesting, and there were lots of questions about this. So we're going to have a look at another aspect of the same issue, perhaps a broader take. I have two experts here. Iván Sánchez, who is the country manager for Colombia, Ecuador, Peru for UFINET, and Lester Benito Garcia, who's the head of connectivity and access policy for Latin America in Facebook. So here's Iván with us. Hi, and welcome. Iván is a great friend of our school. I met him when we held our second school in Mexico. I think it was the third one, actually. He came with Carlos, who at the time was doing the MT in Colombia. And he agreed to hold the 2012 school in Colombia. At the time, Emilio Mulano was minister in Colombia. And we had a telecommunications regulation commission. So whenever we see Iván, it's great to remember how much he helped the school at that time. Lester, welcome. And Lester is in Mexico and Iván is in Bogota. Yes. So thank you very much for being with us today. We have about 40 minutes. This issue always prompts questions. Iván, I'm going to ask you, Iván has a lot of experience as a regulator. And in the private carriers world, he's worked a lot in the region. Perhaps you could tell us what net neutrality actually means and tell us about some of the regulatory issues involved. Because we cannot afford to ignore the huge demand in connectivity that has arisen because of the lockdown, how this has affected internet use. So welcome, Iván, and great to have you with us. Thank you very much, Olga. Good afternoon to everybody who's online. I should like to thank the invitation and the opportunity to take part in the school for yet another year. As Olga said, we're going to focus today on net neutrality. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing from the Telecommunications Regulation Commission so as to achieve the net neutrality legislation in Colombia and to look at how neutrality has been applied over the last few months of the pandemic. So we can continue to manage the network and guarantee everybody connectivity without interruptions and ensuring that they have the best quality possible. I would like to share my screen, my presentation. Hang on just a second. Can we magnify that? Can we zoom on in? Yes, that's lovely. Thank you. So what I want to talk to you about is that there'll be three basic issues: the concept of neutrality, regulation in Colombia, the experience that we've had in this area, and from my point of view, what things we should be looking at in the area of neutrality for the future. So the first is the concept. What is net neutrality? It's a principle which guarantees that everybody has access to all the information and all the services on internet without any kind of interference or manipulation or censorship or limitation on the part of the service providers. This means that everybody should have access to all kinds of content, no matter where they are. Now, why do we believe that neutrality should be a right for internet users? Because it's based on what internet is. Internet was designed as something, a collaboration between the different stakeholders who were involved, and it has continued to develop on the basis of end-to-end connectivity, where all countries and all operators and technical agents can offer a road for this connectivity can function end-to-end, but the principle is that nobody actually touches the information or meddles with it. It has to be transparent. The kind of information that we're sending has to be transparent. There should not be any kind of discrimination between the different information packages. And this is part of the whole principle of collaboration. However, we know that information can be manipulated, that these principles may be violated at some point. And this is why we have decided that the ideal situation is that this be legislated in order to guarantee these respect for these principles and respect for the users. However, there are also people who are criticizing this principle of net neutrality, who say that basically, from an economic point of view, net neutrality might go against certain business models because, from their point of view, making networks available for users to connect should allow the owners of these networks to have the opportunity to make more money out of them. They should be able to profit more substantially by creating priority levels or preference levels in terms of content or some certain ISPs. These are the two positions concerning the principle of net neutrality. Neutrality cannot be above everything else, because this would mean that we would fall into we would have some pitfalls. We cannot put net neutrality over national regulations and legislation. Colombia is a signatory of several international agreements regarding child pornography, for instance. Now, if we put neutrality over that, then we couldn't limit illegal content on our networks. So we need to ensure that neutrality as a principle is respected, but also is governed by issues of legality and the laws in each country. Neutrality in Colombia came about because the Law 1450 of 2011, which was passed by President Santos, obliges the ISPs and gave the Commission the mandate of ensuring that the regulation was properly implemented. In December 2011, there was another resolution, 3502, and we walked on 4 basic principles: the free selection of content, applications, and services, meaning that each user has the right to choose freely from the apps, services, and content that they want. A second principle was a non-discrimination, to ensure that all content, apps, and services received equal treatment, to guarantee once again the free choice on the part of the user. Transparency in terms of traffic management policies, meaning that any manipulation on internet traffic should be duly notified to the users. And finally, the users should be informed about the conditions governing the provision of services. They need to know in which conditions they will be offered services, and if there are any limitations in terms of time or in terms of cost, and this should be informed. Now, this also refers to traffic management. The idea is to mitigate risks and guarantee safety on the red. Now, we can prioritize different kinds of traffic, but not traffic referring to the quality of services. Now, if you have real-time response like voice and video, these could be prioritized as and when such a priority is communicated beforehand to users. The idea is for the service and navigation browsing capacity be provided according to user profile, because there could be different kinds of traffic for different kinds of users. Again, this has to be informed beforehand. Commercial offers for clients, well, this means that they are offers with certain access limitations, because it recognizes there are some users that are never going to use videos, high-resolution videos, and it means that others can access more basic packages, which would obviously cost less. But whenever there is the opportunity to offer limited access to browsing, there must also be costs and rates applied, which are clearly indicated to the user. The important thing is that there must be the appropriate advertising or publicity for this plan, these plans, which inform users exactly what they can do and what they can't. When there are limitations on services, that's what we're talking about. If users don't want, for example, to receive video calls, then they have the right not to have it in any of their apps. This kind of preference is done per profile, and that means that you can eliminate all those kinds of services, but it's up to the user to decide what they want, not the provider. Now, during the pandemic, we found ourselves in a process when we all had to be online. And the continuity of economic activity depended on connectivity. So the Regulatory Commission was authorized to develop some traffic management policies regarding content. And what we tried to do was to reduce video, the amount of space that video was being taken up during peak times, and encouraged users through an education campaign to limit their downloads of videos and encouraging them to do this in off-peak hours. And in this way, we were more or less able to manage the balance of the provision of services. And this was, by and large, very well received. We also prioritized data traffic and prioritized certain other services. There was like a special browsing service for telecoms users so that they could have access to apps allowing them to follow, like to track coronavirus and track and trace apps, for instance. And this was a priority for us. Now, you might say this is possibly a violation of net neutrality, but we're actually talking about the common good, because this was established for everybody across the board. What are we looking forward to in terms of net neutrality? Well, a detailed oversight to ensure that operators and providers do not charge people more than necessary for the content. And neither are they allowed to restrict or eliminate content. If there are differences between, if certain ISPs want their content to be prioritized, those users have to have a possibility to access content provided by other suppliers, other operators. And they should also have the opportunity or the information required to buy premium packages we need to find a balance in the way people pay for access to the network so that all the stakeholders involved in providing these services must take into account the rights of users. We have to be able to cover people's needs first and foremost. However, we are seeing a lot of internet service providers and content providers who are providing services without necessarily going through these channels. We must find a way of ensuring that the content is evenly distributed and that the costs charged are not prohibitive for users. And we're looking at ensuring that the costs are properly distributed amongst users, and we will have to continue working on this. Something that we all need to support is that those countries where net neutrality is not working, we have to help them to find a way of establishing policies that are able to guarantee this principle for users. Now, the dangers of net neutrality is that when we put this above everything else, we would be defending illegal activity. So it doesn't need to be properly regulated and respect national laws. We have to be really careful about contents and browsing because we could be looking at putting net neutrality over everything else. Another point is that when I'm on the browser, for instance, if I click on some kind of specific information, what I want, and the browser provides me with the information, it doesn't give me the sources where I can find the information. It just simply provides me with the information according to the history of my preferences. So actually what's happening there is that I'm not allowed to choose properly. It's like I go to a restaurant and I want a hamburger and the waiter brings me the hamburger that they want me to eat, not the one, and it doesn't offer me any choice. So these are situations that, given the user profile, could be facilitating browsing, but also be associated to an actual limitation of free choice. It's actually curtailing their rights. Olga, thank you, Iván. Very interesting, particularly what you were saying about access to information. Perhaps Lester can tell us a bit more from his point of view about the work he carries out at Facebook and his role. What happens to access to information, these aspects that we saw earlier, the presentation that Luca Belli gave us earlier. And we need to look at what happens when end users can't access sources. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go into detail, but should we be reviewing the principles behind 5G in terms of net neutrality? I'll leave that for the last few minutes. Lester, welcome, and over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I know that you're in Buenos Aires, but I'm sure that everybody misses not being physically in the same space, but at the same time, thanks to technology, we can continue to meet. So I want to tell you a little about our vision from Facebook of net neutrality and certain aspects of what we are doing, and also what has been happening. I'm going to move quickly on because I don't want to repeat what Iván said, but I would like to mention a very brief definition of net neutrality. It means the absence of discrimination regarding content, speed, quality, etc. in internet access. And we're going to continue coming up with this definition throughout the presentation, and I will refer to it again at the end. But basically, the idea is that this has to do with principles. Net neutrality as such is a series of principles which countries have adopted some of them anyway, and they've enshrined it in law as regulations, in guidelines and standards. Several countries in the region have taken this path and have adopted regulations in this area, although, of course, there are differences in the way the issue is treated, which is actually part of the ongoing discussion at the moment. I'm just going to look at the underlying principles and emphasize that in Facebook, we believe in them, we support them. I think Iván mentioned them earlier. Non-blocking or non-strangling, non-throttling. We should not block or degrade or limit any of the content offered on internet. There are also, in practice, so the paid fast lanes on Facebook in particular, we believe that these practices could distort prices and negatively impact on end users. So it's not something that we support. The third point has to do with the question that they asked you. If we take at face value this business of traffic management, it would not be possible, or at least it would go against our principles. However, the nature of the networks means that we have to manage traffic in a reasonable way. 5G, for instance, because of its characteristics, and network slicing require traffic management. Networks have to be managed on the basis of technical rather than commercial considerations. And one basic principle is transparency. ISPs must be transparent when it comes to the offers they place on the market and in the way that they carry out their traffic management and manage the networks, so that the authorities and the users can fully understand and transparently understand what is going on. Today, I'd like to look at an important issue, not only because it involves a practice which is already being followed, but also because it is a mechanism which many countries in the region are using to support users and, in general, support the dissemination of information, particularly in the context of COVID. It's the issue of zero rating. In general terms, it refers to the packages or the inclusiveness of a service or an app as part of a service which a user is hiring or paying for. Obviously, this is a commercial setup. This is the interesting bit because it's commercial, right? Operators, carriers, follow usual practice when trying to attract users in the way that they present their best offers. And what they do is they package these offers and place them on the market. But in practice, for Facebook and other companies, and especially now during the pandemic, zero rating has been a very important practice to promote connectivity and promote access. And it means that we're looking at things in a different way. And it goes to the root of the question of my presentation, because net neutrality is a principle which the market, in practice, handles in such a way that everything's so dynamic. We have new situations, new measures need to be taken, and we have to look at what net neutrality means in this context. Now, zero rating does not actually meet free content. We're saying this there is no such thing as a free lunch because there's always somebody paying for the access. Now, in these zero rating offers on the market today, generally, these are classified. Who pays for it is the operator. For instance, Facebook doesn't pay anything for its offers. We just make sure that there are certain applications available in a certain package, and pure zero rating would be apps like freebasing or others which are completely free. Mostly these are absorbed, the cost of these are absorbed by the operators because they have legitimate marketing objectives. And during the pandemic, this practice was requested by the authorities, and in others they were proposed as optional by the operators themselves with a view to helping their users through this time. There are other commercial practices, such as, for instance, our online bank doesn't charge us for accessing. Sorry, people don't get charged for accessing the online bank, and the access is paid for by the bank. Other practices, similar ones, are on Facebook, for instance. We don't sponsor data use as such, but certain apps do. And that is also a way of offering access and connectivity to users. So there are various aspects to this market, this ecosystem. On the side of supply, your operators are looking for economies of scale in ways of offering their packages, their data consumption packages to users. And we're looking also at the issue of cost per mega for access. And there are all kinds of different ways of attracting users by putting together these interesting offers and packages. Now, at the same time, there are greater and greater demand for access to these kinds of services and all OTT services. You need to give certain data in order to do this. And this particularly happens in the context of zero rating offers. And prices are obviously falling because you can access more and more kinds of offers at cheaper rates. Facebook has been promoting zero rating as a connectivity scheme for some time. We have a particular service called Discover, which is a freebasing system. Freebasics is still new. It's an experience, if you like, or a way of accessing part of internet through an app where you have access to certain content which are defined by the app itself so that users can access it free. This kind of content obviously are free of heavy data. They're quite light. There's no images, there's no video. And this is kind of like a new generation in the sense that the owners of the content do not have to define their own content. Discover offers all these kinds of content already on internet, and this is leading to a discussion as to whether this is complying with net neutrality. Discover is a free browser being offered today in the region, only Peru, by 4 Peruvian operators. We hope that they will open into new markets very soon. There are other operators, as well as Facebook, obviously very interested in this. I should like to emphasize that Discover, in addition to meeting net neutrality principles, is a free app which is being offered by operators with Facebook through their several packages. Discover is trying to comply not only with net neutrality principles, but also with the basic principles of openness and competitiveness. It's non-exclusive, as any operator can offer the program. It's non-discriminatory, because it allows people to browse any kind of content. and it uses free basics. It's free, it doesn't charge a thing. It's totally transparent in the sense that it tells users when they are using data that they would have to pay for, and how much free data they can use per day. Going back to basic issues, regulatory issues, I would like to take another look at the scenario of a dynamic, shifting market in a context where principles are highly important and technology is moving ahead and developing, creating new needs and scenarios. So in this market, where we have so many different offers, I would like to highlight the fact that it is so dynamic that 2 or 3 years ago, we weren't even talking about zero rating apps, which have been developed in response to the current scenario. And we are also looking at new offers arising all the time. So it's a very dynamic market. Today, there are all kinds of apps, transport apps and music apps, things that weren't around 4 or 5 years ago. All kinds of schemes and setups for payment, post-payment services, different kinds of contents, ways of packaging data. At the end of the day, the idea is to respond to user demand. This is, after all, a commercial offer. In terms of regulating the offers, a zero rating is not mutually exclusive to net neutrality. There are regulatory environments where they might be mutually exclusive. As Iván was saying, there could be, after all, every country can interpret this principle as they will and adapt it as necessary and adapt their regulations and legislation accordingly. But from our point of view, according to net neutrality, zero rating complies with the principles because it doesn't block the data on the part of the operator. There is no discrimination. In terms of content, it's not that you can't access different kinds of content, but the consumer is taking their own decisions. Zero rating responds to that dynamic of a new market. Those of us who worked in telecom will remember how the market developed for telecom when they were looking at the mobile packages and mobile rates. These are commercial schemes which respond to this new dynamic. There is some regulatory concern in terms of avoiding blockages. We want to avoid discrimination, obviously, and the recommendation that we are making, let's say the stance that Facebook has taken, and as pretty much anybody who understands this would take, is a regulatory one, that in order to provide incentives to innovation of market dynamics, we must deal with the regulatory challenges. Having seen the effects of these in the market, the regulator can then move to solve them and take the necessary actions. Iván talked to us about what Colombia had done in this area. I would like to revisit the issue of regulation and legislation and net neutrality, which has been dealt with in different ways and by different countries. In Europe, for instance, they have a far more restrictive view of zero rating, and they have a more restrictive view in general of net neutrality. We should understand, however, that the reality in those markets is quite different. I'm sure that in Europe, these practices were not perhaps as prevalent during the pandemic as they were in South America in terms of developing access and connectivity. Here, everything was far more necessary in that sense. In Chile, by law and according to regulation, zero rating was prohibited as a market practice because it was seen as anti-net neutrality, but then they have market reality. In 2015, they finally allowed it to happen with certain restrictions. And in the United States, as we know, this is already last year, they passed the Internet Film Act, Freedom Order. And these are principles which means that they need to be tackled from the point of view of a specific jurisdiction and competences. In 2019, they had the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, but there is no obligation to follow this as yet. In Mexico, there are currently no need otherwise than from suppliers to register their tariffs, their rates, as the focus is an ex post focus. Today, we are looking at net neutrality in a broader context across the continent. In our region, I think that we are beginning to recognize the value of zero rating as a tool to promote connectivity, particularly during the pandemic. And then, of course, there are other practices which may be considered detractors to net neutrality, to freedom, which is how you manage traffic, how you manage the networks. Facebook, like other content providing companies, we've reduced our bit rates, our user rates, in order to ensure that we did not saturate the networks during the pandemics when people so desperately needed the bandwidth for more basic apps, such as kids studying at school, or the health apps, or their parents working, and so on and so forth. So I think that this takes us to the principle of the beginning of my talk, when I said net neutrality. When I said that net neutrality refers to the absence of discrimination in access. And I would now ask if this market dynamic is beginning to define us, and what does it mean? What does absence mean? What does discrimination mean? And I don't mean by this that these principles are not sacred. I'm just saying that the market is moving so quickly, as is technology, that net neutrality as a principle is not exclusive from this reality. The question on the table is now, should we take a more flexible approach to principles, or should we change the way that we interpret them in the view of the market realities and the challenges that are around the corner? It's not just about zero rating. I think we need to take a longer view in the way traffic is managed, particularly in the context of the pandemic. And of course, we also need to bear in mind that 5G will bring about changes in the way we manage traffic. So I just want to leave you with this idea that obviously it is important to regulate. We need to keep the market in order and secure common goals of competitiveness and satisfy the users. But we also need to ensure that regulate promotes innovation and that it be technologically neutral. And in that sense, Facebook is promoting this focus, this ex post focus on ensuring that there is due competitiveness and that users can choose freely. And we hope that this will progress efficiently in the future. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lester and Iván. This issue prompts so many questions. Lester actually answered my questions as he went on when his presentation. I have lots of questions from lots of people from all over the place. I think that one of the most important things can be summarized in what's the limit between freedom and censorship when there is malicious content, when there is child pornography, or some government makes some censors content. In that sense, just where does net neutrality come into it in this context? When we're talking about the non-publication of certain content or censorship or freedom of expression, and we have to finish now because there's no more time. Yes, if you will allow me, I'll answer this very quickly. I'm not the expert here in the company, but basically, whoever goes into Facebook, opens Facebook, is in agreement to abide by certain practices and rules, community ones, certain rules, if you like. And these include what the platform allows people to do and not to do. What can we see and what can we not see? Obviously, what we're trying to do is eliminate illegal content, which is what the community rules say. But these are also internal practices because it means that whoever uses Facebook is signing up for these rules. Now, this isn't a net neutrality issue. It's about content because it's part of the service that we provide. We have rules about what you do, and whoever opens the app is assumed to be signing up to these rules. So the networks, which you might say, which might ask themselves if they are complying or not with net neutrality, it's not the apps. It's not an obligation on the suppliers as such. There would not be any responsibility on the part of the networks because those content would have otherwise to be eliminated from the platform. If the law prohibits certain content from being shown in certain apps, obviously we're talking about things like child pornography, then that would also not be an attack on net neutrality in the sense that that very same authority would have determined it as such. Beyond Facebook, the issue is that principle of neutrality must be subject to national and international laws. National laws can only go so far. Otherwise, they become restrictive. And that is probably happening in many countries. We other countries should ensure that this does not happen. Now, as for malicious information, we've listened to so much debate about content on social networks which might be offensive or harmful to other people. Beyond the issue of regulation or the principle of neutrality, I think these are kind of basic principles of respect to avoid certain situations occurring where platforms have to start editing or censoring or filtering the information provided by their users. It's really up to each one of us to control these situations. The principle of neutrality should adhere strictly to the laws enforced in each country. I think that's what we really need to be looking at. But it's a thorny issue, doesn't it? Because you can either go too far one way or too far the other way. Well, thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. There was lots of interaction here. I hope that this all goes well. I wish you the very best with your work. A big hug to you. And thank you so much for joining us at the school, Iván and Lester. Lester, this is your first time, and for Iván, he's a long-time friend. Big hugs from Buenos Aires. Greetings from Adrián too. I hope to see you in person sooner rather than later. Bye-bye. Goodbye. Okay, I'm going to ask you for a few minutes while we get on with the next panel.